On various occasions, I have often joked about this assertion that in the attempt to reach God through human history, humanity has attempted to always want to change God so that they reduce God from the sovereign being, the unchanging God who He is, to one who is like man, who does things like man, and who changes like man. And my assertion always is that God is not like man, that He can change, because God remains sovereign. And this is the topic we are going to examine. The topic of our God, who is the unchanging God. So let us take a few moments to reflect about this idea, the idea that God does not change. And we find that this idea is rooted in various religious and philosophical beliefs, particularly in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, there are many reasons why God cannot change and does not change. Let us underline that in our mind, that God does not change, God cannot change, God will not change. Whatever your aspirations, imagination, or newfound philosophy may tell you. So I'll give you 6 reasons why this is so. The first one is the nature of perfection. So we know, and our religion asserts, that God is perfect. Now, change is often seen as something that occurs due to imperfections or incompleteness. But since God is believed to be fully complete, lacking nothing, He would not need to change in order to become better or more complete. God does not have to become anything else. Change is what happens to things that are imperfect, things that are not complete, things that have no form and that are developing a different nature or every other time. But the nature of God is the nature of perfection. Our God is a perfect God. The second reason is timelessness. Now, in many religious traditions, God is eternal. God is eternal. That means that He exists outside the confines of time. So God was there before time, God is there within time, and God will be there without time or even after time. So time, being created and a finite aspect of existence, requires change as events unfold. And since God exists beyond time, He does not experience change in the way that created things do. So that aspect of timelessness tells you God cannot change, will not change, and is impossible of change. The third reason is immutability in Scripture. In the Bible, God's immutability, the idea that God does not change, is emphasized in many verses. For example, Malachi 3:6 says, "For I, the Lord, do not change." Malachi 3:6 says, "For I, the Lord, do not change." Hebrews 13:8 states, "Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever." This consistency is a cornerstone of faith. It provides believers with the assurance that God's character, promises, and plans will remain the same forever. The fourth reason why God cannot change and will not change is dependability and stability. If God were to change, it could imply uncertainty or unpredictability, which could challenge the foundation of trust that believers place in him. A changing God would be unreliable, but an unchanging God provides stable foundation for faith and hope. So you can believe in this God, because once you put your hope and trust in him, you can depend on him, because he's not about to change. The promises he makes for you today will remain true tomorrow and for many years to come. So God does not change. He's a dependable and stable God. The fifth reason is God's will is constant. The will of God. In many theological views, God's will is seen as perfect and eternal. If God were to change his will or purpose, it could suggest a flaw or a lack of a foreknowledge. The belief that God's purpose is eternal and unchanging gives comfort to believers that his plans for humanity and the world are sure. And the sixth reason is that the unchanging love and justice. In Christianity, God's love, justice, and holiness are seen as unchanging. If these aspects were to change, it would imply that God's moral character could shift, which would undermine the concept of absolute truth and justice. So the belief that God does not change is tied to the idea that God is perfect, is eternal, and is trustworthy. Change is often associated with imperfection, time, and uncertainty, none of which apply to God, who is seen as the ultimate source of stability and consistency. So, we can say that man may change in many ways, but God will remain the same. Let us look at that from a number of views. I'll try to explore it in 5 viewpoints. The first viewpoint is human imperfection versus divine perfection. People are subject to change because of their imperfections. That is number one. Whether in their understanding, behavior, or circumstances. Over time, individuals grow, evolve, or face challenges that lead to change. However, God, as the ultimate source of perfection, is not subject to these fluctuations. His nature is seen as flawless and complete, so he does not need to change in the way that human beings do. Number two, like we discussed earlier, the immutable nature of God. The concept of God's immutability, the unchanging nature, is foundational in Christian teachings. It is emphasized in the scriptures like the Hebrews we read that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The idea gives believers a sense of stability and assurance because they know that God's nature, promises, and love are constant and unshakable, regardless of the changes around them. The third reason, or the third factor or aspect I want to explore, is human transformation versus God's steadfastness. While human beings experience change as part of their journey, growing, learning, and sometimes even struggling with the flaws, God's nature remains unchanged. This offers a sense of comfort and security. Even though humans may go through seasons of hardship, growth, and transformation, the belief is that God's love, grace, and justice remain constant, providing a reliable foundation for faith. The fourth point I want us to consider is God's sovereignty and control. While human life is full of uncertainties and transformations, many believe that God's unchanging nature reflects his ultimate control over the world. This is important because it reassures believers that God's plan for the world even in the face of changes and challenges, is always in motion and never disrupted. And finally, the fifth aspect or reason or point or fact I want us to consider is God's unchanging character. The attributes of God, God's attributes, His love, holiness, justice, and mercy are unchanging. For believers, this consistency means that they can always count on these qualities of God to be the same, no matter the circumstances or their own personal changes. In essence, the idea that humans change but God remains the same emphasizes the deep contrast between the finite and the infinite, the created and the creator. It offers a powerful message that no matter what happens in life, God's nature is unwavering and His promises are sure. The idea that changing man fails to understand the unchanging God touches on a profound theological and philosophical concept, the limitations of human understanding in contrast to the infinite and eternal nature of God. Now let us speak about this idea from several key points. The idea that the changing man fails to understand the unchanging God. So the first point is finite versus infinite understanding. Human beings are limited by time, space, and experience. Our understanding is shaped by the ever-changing world around us. We observe change in ourselves, in others, and in the universe, and we tend to interpret everything based on these shifting realities. In contrast, God, as the eternal and unchanging being, exists outside of time. God's knowledge, perspective, and essence are not influenced by time or the vicissitudes of the world. So human limitations, our perceptions are clouded by our experience, emotions, and the passage of time. We can't fully comprehend what it means for God to be eternal, unchanging, and infinite, because we are inherently bound by the changing nature of life. So God's infinite wisdom, God's wisdom, truth, and plans remain constant and unchanging, but human minds can struggle to grasp the fullness of this. We may question or fail to understand God's actions or decisions, especially when we view them through the lens of our own temporal, limited experience. Number 2 point that you have to consider here is misunderstanding due to change. Because human beings are in the constant state of flux, growing, maturing, encountering new challenges, and experiencing shifting desires, it can be difficult for them to relate to or comprehend a being that is constant. The changes we experience might create doubts or confusion about God's nature, especially when we encounter suffering, loss, or unanswered prayers. So our emotional struggles, our emotions and experience often change how we view the world, and by extension, how we perceive God. When things go well, we may feel closer to God. When life is difficult, we may question God's goodness or presence. In the spiritual growth, as individuals mature in their faith, they may gradually come to a deeper understanding of God's unchanging nature. The growth involves recognizing that while our own understanding and circumstances evolve, God's essence and nature are always the same. The fourth aspect or factor or reason is that faith and trust beyond understanding. Faith and trust beyond understanding is another reason why we fail to understand the unchanging God. The inability to fully understand God's unchanging nature often leads to the necessity of faith. Religious traditions often emphasize the importance of trusting in God's eternal wisdom, even when we can't fully understand His reasons or actions. Beliefs in an unchanging God requires accepting that His ways are beyond our comprehension, yet trusting that His character is ultimately good and trustworthy. Trust in God's plan. While humans change and their understanding fluctuates, faith invites believers to trust that God's eternal purposes are being worked out even when they don't see the full picture. Unchanging promises. Despite the changes in human life, God's promises and His character remain constant. Believers find assurance in this constance, even when the path ahead is unclear. Now, the fourth factor, and the second last, is the mystery of God's nature. Many religious traditions emphasize the mystery of God's nature and the limitations of human understanding. The Bible, for instance, speaks of God as being beyond full comprehension. Isaiah 55, 8-9 states, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This highlights the distinction between the human and divine perspective. While we are subject to change, God is not. To truly grasp the unchanging nature of God requires humility, the acceptance that some aspects of God's nature are beyond human grasp. Finally, the last point is, in many religious traditions, God reveals Himself to humanity. So the role of revelation and faith. But these revelations are often seen as partial or limited to human limitations. Through sacred texts, prophets, or personal experiences, humans come to understand more about God's unchanging nature. But this understanding is always, in some sense, incomplete. The challenge of humans is to accept that even though we may not fully comprehend God's nature, we can still know Him and trust in His unchanging love and purpose. So the changing nature of humanity, marked by emotional, intellectual, and experiential fluctuations, often makes it difficult to fully comprehend the unchanging nature of God. Human beings may question or struggle to understand God's actions or existence, especially in times of difficult uncertainty. However, many religious teachings emphasize that while human understanding is limited and ever-evolving, God's nature remains constant. Faith in the unchanging God's call for trust, humility, and recognition that God's wisdom far exceeds human comprehension. Thank you very much.